The UBS and Credit Suisse not a bailout deal. Do we need to follow the money and not their words? Hi, everyone, and welcome to Insights, brought to you by Ainsley Bullion and the Gold and Silver Standard. Today, we welcome back Branko into the discussion on a very busy Wednesday for markets, with banking bailouts and contagion ongoing, and an all-important interest rate decision coming out of the US very early tomorrow morning, our time. How's it all going, Branko?
Good, Chris. Thanks for having me back on. Keen for this discussion today.
I'm very keen for this as well because it was a great piece again today. We've been looking at this issue over the last, couple of weeks really, but it's really come to full attention this week in the discussions over what's going on with these banks and the bailouts and whether they're bailouts, what's going on. So can we start off with that big picture sort of overview? What happened, or what's your take on this UBS Credit Suisse arrangement? What's actually going on there?
Yeah, so let's just a bit of background before we kind of dive in here. UBS has kind of bought out Credit Suisse. It's about $100 billion. So two separate things. So UBS and Credit Suisse are kind of combining together, but the government is pseudo sponsoring the deal, providing UBS with $100 billion in what's titled as liquidity assistance and $9 billion in guaranteed kind of loss help. And the details of that is that if UBS can lose the first $5 billion in the deal, and then the government will be on the hook for the next $9 billion. So it's a very, favorable deal for the banks and probably not so favorable for the government. But it's kind of dominated the news headlines, and it's something we've been talking about actually for a while. There was a piece we did in November talking about how Credit Suisse was in danger.
Yep.
And we discussed a little bit later the swap lines and how the government was sending them all this money through there to fund Credit Suisse, and it didn't work. So we've been on this for a while, and this is obviously a very big issue at the moment.
And I just find that so amusing, and it's not funny at all, but it's ridiculous is what it is, because you've got a situation here where we're told, this isn't a bailout, but as you just described, very favorable terms for one entity where the other entity takes on all the risk and takes on all the losses is a bailout, right? By any other definition.
Yeah.
It seems like we go to massive amounts of effort to hide the fact that it's a bailout or word it differently. So in your mind, is it a bailout? I'm sure I know the answer to that one already, but
yeah.
Why is that? What's going on here?
Well, I mean, basically, loan assistance, liquidity assistance, guaranteed loss. These terms are basically giving away free money to UBS and Credit Suisse, who I remind you, the bonuses were giving out only hours before Credit Suisse actually declared bankruptcy,
isn't it?
Which
Yeah.
is
So that
very
was
interesting.
And
What
that
a
was
coincidence that
executives
is.
and lots of people, wasn't it, who were getting a big
Absolutely. So it's a complete transfer of wealth. But I guess the most frustrating point on my end is that you have the Swiss finance minister come out and say this isn't a bailout. This is a commercial solution, apparently, even though the Swiss government is providing all this funding towards it. So this kind of major focus on winning the PR war that it isn't a bailout, which we've seen in last week's bank bailout as well, is increasingly frustrating. And I think they're doing this because of all the kind of flack they endured, or America endured and other countries endured in 2008, when there were a lot more bank bailouts and they could see the public weren't happy with it. So they're trying to change the narrative, but I don't think it's working.
And do you think something that's been playing on my mind? Do you think that they're having to do this as well because they don't actually have the authority in a lot of cases to go in and do something like a bailout? So this is central banks acting and government finance departments acting pretty much independently of any taking this back to, like in the US, taking it back to Congress, or in Australia, taking it to our representatives and actually debating it and passing laws to allow these things to happen. They're really using the tools that they have at their disposal, which may not be fit for purpose at all. So, sometimes they might technically be able to say this isn't a bailout because it's not, like, technically it probably isn't a bailout. It's not on the books as a bailout. It's not passed through that legal process. But do you think that as well? Because that's what I'm starting to think is
Yeah,
that
I think that's a great point. I think they're bypassing kind of the public's, like bypassing
scrutiny.
having a vote
Yeah.
or public scrutiny or anything that would kind of put attention on it as to the actual terms of this agreement. You know, a guaranteed loss, like being able to guarantee that, oh, if I lose 9 billion, the government's got it, like that. Like, what else would you call that? Like, I know it might not technically be a bailout, but in what world would any small business just get a guaranteed loss? Like, you know, it doesn't make any sense. But that's a
And
great point that they're trying to bypass.
stretching that a bit further, I don't know where it will end up, but that's the talk in the US at the moment about potentially guaranteeing all bank deposits. And I know there's been some pushback from from representatives or the elected people in Congress. They're saying, well, that creates a massive problem if you just guarantee all deposits, because then where's the moral imperative to do the right thing? But that's similar. At the moment, they have just been doing that. It's implied, and we've talked about this before as well. It's implied that if your money's on deposit in any of these institutions, that it's safe.
Yeah, and that's the biggest kind of moral hazard issue we would have ever, if they could just play with depositor money and it wouldn't matter, because if they lose it, they lose it.
And everyone feels safe and nothing happens.
Yeah.
It's a scary thought. So what do you see as the parallels between what's happened here in Credit Suisse and the SVB situation? Like, it feels like that was, a year ago, but it was a week ago. That's the world we're living in at the moment. These major events that happen one after the other, all as a result of faster than, record fast rate rises. So are there parallels? Are there differences? How do you see the play between those two?
Yeah, I think they're obviously very similar, like major banks that have both been kind of now bankrupt. Both were hit by the rising kind of interest rates affecting their bond positions. SVB a lot more than Credit Suisse, but Credit Suisse was hit nonetheless. And I think Credit Suisse is obviously a lot bigger than Silicon Valley Bank. But I think the interesting point about Credit Suisse is that this has actually been kind of going on publicly for quite a few months. And the Silicon Valley Bank one seemed to be, at least in my opinion, a bit more sudden, and we didn't really have the kind of rumors circulating around it, which is a lot more interesting. But we had Credit Suisse have all these rumors for what seems like an eternity, months, which is a lot in this space at the moment. And they were able to actually sustain that period thanks to the swap lines. So the swap lines gave them all this time on life support because they were being funneled money. When SVB, you started hearing chatter, it was like a few days later, it was gone because they didn't get that same support during that time. They will get it now, but that's just kind of some key things to keep in mind about both cases.
And Credit Suisse, I keep hearing the term sort of globally important, that you've got banks. It's almost two tiers that we're working with here. Some are systemically important across the globe, and they just cannot be allowed to fail. That's the old too big to fail, but cannot be allowed to fail globally. And Credit Suisse would have fallen into that camp, wouldn't it?
Yeah, they were the second largest bank in Switzerland. I think they were top 20. They were the top 20 in the world from memory. Don't quote me on that one. So they're obviously extremely large, and SVB was, a lot smaller, being only the 15th biggest bank in the US. So that's why obviously a lot more focus is on Credit Suisse.
So what does this mean then? So if we're going forward in an environment where the landscape is changing very rapidly because of what we've seen happen in these two examples, are there more banks to come? Is this it? And it certainly looks like it today, because you've got the market, or last night, the market in the US was relatively strong, heading up a little bit, but it can head up a little bit and still head it down a lot. That's what happens in this type of environment. Yeah. So how do you read it? Are there more banks to come? Are we at the end of this? Where are we in this cycle?
Yeah, I think one of the big takeaways is if you're a major bank, like, it's a great time to be a major bank. If you're a Goldman Sachs or even a UBS after this, like, to know that you can just get bailed out now, like, because they've set the precedent with Credit Suisse, right? And they've set the precedent with SVB. But if you're a major bank and they really need you and you're too big to fail, like, you can do whatever you want now. Like, apparently, it doesn't matter. So in terms of the shares of those big banks, honestly, I would expect them to go up as long as they kind of survive this little scary period, because they're going to have so much ability, and so much incentive to really just push for higher yields and higher profits at the potential expense of the taxpayer. So that's one takeaway.
That's a really good point, and I hadn't really thought about that, but that actually explains a lot of why we're seeing that bounce back in those regional banks last night in the US, doesn't it? Because you make a really good point. They have nothing to fear by buying those shares if the banks aren't going to be allowed to fail.
Yeah, I mean it's crazy that's where we're at, but I think that is where we're at. And the other takeaway is, maybe you could talk more about this, but the possibility of potential rate cuts and because in order to for the government to probably provide SVB the capital they need to bail them out, that might involve rate cuts and the way that impacts the interest rates. That's also something to monitor and a potential takeaway.
Yeah, and that's something that I've been looking at. I think we're almost talking about two different things here. We've got the consequence of the rate rising, which is these banks failing, but we have the solution to the banks failing means banks have to be profitable. And the only way that can happen is with the yield curve uninverting, because it's been inverted. We've had the rates at the long end, so your longer dated government bonds being lower than the 2-year shorter or shorter dated government bonds, which is what is called an inverted yield curve. Inverted yield curves mean it's not profitable for the banks because the banks want to borrow the money off people on the short end and lend it out on the long end. So while that's not profitable, banks will continue to fail, is my view. So the solution to the problem is actually getting that yield curve back around the right way. And the only way to do that is by lowering rates. So the question becomes, are they prepared to actually solve the problem, or do they continue moving forward trying to achieve both things at once, trying to keep rates high, but also as you worded in the article, sort of band-aid and paper over the cracks with the banks as they keep failing? I mean, it's a massive question.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to keep raising rates, but also keep increasing the money supply and pumping money in the system to bail these banks out. It doesn't really that doesn't make sense to me, how that would even work.
Because they run at some point, people are not going to be happy with. They're already not happy with it, but after a couple of banks, they're not happy with it. If we get 5 to 10 banks, all of a sudden, people would be very unhappy with it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Branko, thanks for all of that. I think we might get the answers. Well, not the answers, but we might get a little bit more insight into the answers around this very early tomorrow morning, our time, when we see what the Fed actually does with their rate rising. And we may get some commentary around that. There's talk at the moment that we might get the rate rise, but also commentary that sort of counteracts the rate rise. So who knows what's going to happen, but we'll be watching that very closely, and I'm sure you will be as well. So thank you for all that today.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks everyone for watching. If you have any other questions about any of this, feel free to let us know on the social platforms. We love reading those comments, and it really does help us to decide what we're going to talk about next and give us new insight ourselves into the angles we want to go with it. So keep those coming. That's us for today. Stay safe in the markets, everyone. It's going to be a big night. We'll be watching closely what happens next. We're getting up early tomorrow probably to watch it. And I'll be back on Monday with Alex, and no doubt we'll be discussing the fallout from that rate decision then. So thanks everyone, and we'll talk to you then.